What would you think if a teacher, entrusted with the noble task of nurturing young minds, stood before a classroom in front of innocent eyes and ruthlessly humiliated a black boy, not because he was foolish, not because he was short, but because he told the truest story about himself? Ethan Jones, 11 years old, stood in the middle of the classroom with trembling hands, but a voice brimming with courage, declaring that his father was Elon Musk, a name the world knows through electric cars soaring into space and wild dreams of changing the planet. To Ethan, it wasn't a billionaire genius or a TV icon, but simply Dad. Yet instead of being heard, instead of being respected, he was met with mocking laughter, scornful glances, and the cold dismissal of his teacher, Mrs. Harper. She looked at him, a black boy with curly, messy hair and a faded graphic tee, and smirked, as if his truth were a joke not worth her time. "Elon Musk? Do you think we're that stupid?" she said, her voice sharp as a blade slicing through Ethan's self-worth, while the class erupted in laughter, the sound echoing like it was shattering every hope he'd brought to school that day. No one believed him, not for lack of proof, but because in their eyes, his skin color couldn't align with someone like Elon Musk, a symbol of power, wealth, and whiteness they'd already painted in their minds. They didn't see the quiet, late-night whispers, the handwritten letters, or the warm gaze Ethan remembered forever from a father he only met in fleeting moments amid the storm of fame. The class kept laughing, Mrs. Harper kept teaching, and Ethan stood there, trapped in his own silence, reduced to a question mark no one bothered to answer. But what they didn't expect, what no one in that stifling room could imagine, was that truth never bends to prejudice. It waits. And when the classroom door swung open on an ordinary imagined morning, the towering figure of a man stepped in, bringing a silence heavier than any laughter that had rung out before. Elon Musk didn't come to boast, didn't come to prove anything to the world, but to stand by his son, to shine light into the dark corner of doubt and bias that had weighed on Ethan's shoulders for too long. Stay with us, because this story isn't just a cry for justice. It's the quiet roar of truth, strong enough to make the whole world listen. This morning, the air in the small town of Rockford, South Carolina, hung heavy, pressed down by gray clouds looming in the sky. Ethan Jones stood in front of his weathered wooden house, its peeling paint revealing scars of time that his mother, Lena, never had the money to fix. He adjusted the fraying straps of his worn backpack, his scuffed sneakers sinking into the damp earth from last night's rain. Lena knelt beside him, retying his laces one last time, her rough hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the quiet worry every black mother carries when sending her child out the door. "You're smart, you're strong, and you're enough," she whispered, her voice thick with the weight of long nights at the sewing factory. Ethan nodded, but he didn't feel sure. He'd been the new kid at 3 schools before, used to probing stares and cold silences. But Rockford felt different, like he and his mom had stumbled into a world that didn't welcome them. When the school bus screeched to a stop in front of him, Ethan climbed aboard, and instantly, the chatter of the kids inside dulled to a hushed murmur, just loud enough for him to know he was being watched. Unfamiliar eyes slid over him, some curious, others indifferent, but all tinged with distance. He picked a seat near the back, clutching his backpack like a shield, staring out the fogged window. Through the glass, he saw his mom's figure, small and steadfast, until the bus rounded a corner and she faded from view. Rockford Middle School loomed ahead with its clean hallways, banners proclaiming "Character is everything" dangling on the walls, and neatly trimmed shrubs around the flagpole. But as Ethan stepped through the gate, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. The cold of eyes that grazed him and then looked away as if his presence were a question no one wanted to answer. Room 305, where Mrs. Harper waited, was Ethan's first stop of the day. Mrs. Harper, a woman in her 50s with sleek blonde hair cropped short and sharp silver-framed glasses, was calling roll when Ethan walked in. She glanced up, her eyes flicking over him like a blink, then offered a smile. Thin, barely reaching her eyes. "We have a new student," she announced, her tone flat like she was reading an unimportant note. "This is Ethan Jones from... where, again?" "Charlotte," Ethan answered softly. But Mrs. Harper had already turned back to the board, uninterested in hearing the rest. "Find a seat," she said, waving vaguely toward the desks. A white boy named Ryan, sitting by the window, grimaced as Ethan approached, then reluctantly shoved his bag aside after Mrs. Harper called his name a second time. Ethan sat, hands clasped tight on the desk, trying to breathe evenly so no one could see how fast his heart was pounding. He tried to fit in, he really did. He raised his hand when he knew the answer, listened to the lecture on colonial history, even smiled faintly when Mrs. Harper cracked a joke about South Carolina's muggy weather. But every time he raised his hand, she looked past him, calling on someone else like he was invisible. When he answered a question right in group work, she gave a curt nod. No praise. While Ryan, the boy who'd grimaced, got a beaming smile and a clap on the back just for reading a paragraph aloud. By lunchtime, Ethan could feel the gap widening between him and everyone else. He carried his tray through the noisy cafeteria, but every time he neared an empty table, kids shifted away, whispering or pretending the spot was taken. Eventually, he sat alone in the farthest corner, picking at a dry sandwich, while laughter and voices rang out like a song he wasn't allowed to join. Once he caught his name in the murmurs, followed by a few snickers. He didn't look up. The days that followed blurred into a dull loop. Ethan learned to keep his head down, to stay quiet, to make himself small so no one would notice. He didn't want trouble, didn't want to be labeled a problem. But the ache inside him grew, like a wound that didn't bleed. At home, when his mom asked, "How was today?" he always said, "Fine," then hid in his room, closing the door so she wouldn't see his red eyes. Lena didn't press, but sometimes she lingered outside, fists clenched, as if she wanted to smash the world hurting her son. Once, she told him, her voice firm like a vow, "Never let anyone make you think you're not enough, Ethan." The words echoed in his head, but he didn't know how to believe them in the midst of days spent trapped in invisibility. Then, one Monday morning, Mrs. Harper stood at the front of the class, tapping her desk for attention. "Next week we'll have Career Hero Day," she announced, her eyes sweeping the room without landing on Ethan. "Each of you will prepare a short presentation about someone in your family, ideally a parent or grandparent, and share what they do, why they inspire you." The class buzzed with excitement. "My mom's a doctor. My dad drives a truck. My grandma was in the army." Ethan sat up straighter, feeling a spark flicker in his chest for the first time since arriving. He knew what he'd say. That night, in his small bedroom with its chipped walls and creaky bed, Ethan dug out an old shoebox from under the mattress. Inside were keepsakes he'd guarded closely, a handwritten birthday card, a scribbled post-it note, and a faded photo. In the picture, a younger Elon Musk, hair tousled and sporting a rare smile, held a newborn Ethan tight, his gaze soft, not for the camera, but for his son. His mom had told him the truth long ago. Elon had been part of her life before Tesla, SpaceX, and the spotlight pulled him into a different world where secrets became walls of protection. No articles mentioned Ethan, no public statements, but there were late-night calls, brief visits cloaked in shadow, and a deep, warm voice he'd never forget. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Now, holding the photo, tracing his father's smile, Ethan decided it was time to speak his truth, not to brag, but to prove who he was. All week, He wrote and rewrote his presentation, practicing in front of the mirror, trying to steady his voice. My dad's name is Elon Musk. He's my hero because, despite his fame, he tells me to be proud of myself, to stand tall, and never be ashamed of who I am. His mom watched silently from the hallway, her eyes a mix of pride and worry. "Tell the truth, Ethan," she said, "but brace yourself if they don't believe you." On Thursday, the day before the presentation, Ethan carefully slipped the photo into a plastic sleeve, tucking it into his backpack like a talisman. During recess, as he sat alone reviewing his speech, Ryan and two other kids approached. "So," Ryan sneered, his tone taunting, "who are you going to say your dad is tomorrow? Superman? Batman?" Ethan looked up, calmly replying, "Elon Musk." A brief pause, then laughter erupted, not just from Ryan, but from the kids nearby. "Elon Musk?" Ryan howled, tears in his eyes. "You're kidding, right? Look at you. He's a white billionaire, and you—" He trailed off, but his eyes said the rest. "Maybe your mom made it up," another kid chimed in, and the laughter swelled again. Ethan felt heat flood his ears, his hands clenching, but he said nothing. When they walked away, he pulled out the photo, staring at his dad's smile. Still warm, still real, but now it felt distant, fragile, like something this world would never accept. For the first time, he wondered if speaking his truth was worth the pain it brought. He didn't know that tomorrow, in front of the class, his truth wouldn't just be laughed at. It would be broken by the very person meant to teach and protect him. Friday morning arrived like a quiet storm, the sky outside Ethan's window still overcast, thick clouds pressing down as if to weigh further on his mind. He woke early, lying in bed listening to the patter of rain on the roof, trying to take deep breaths to shake off the heaviness in his chest. Today was Career Hero Day, the day he'd prepared for all week, the day he hoped would change everything. He put on the blue shirt his mom had ironed the night before, smoothed his curly hair in the mirror, and mentally rehearsed his presentation one last time. "My dad is Elon Musk. He taught me to be proud of myself." His voice faltered, not from fear, but from a vague premonition that his truth wouldn't be received as he'd hoped. He checked his backpack again, ensuring the photo, his only proof, was still safe in its plastic sleeve, then stepped out of his room with stiff shoulders. On the bus, the atmosphere was no different from usual. The whispers started as soon as Ethan climbed the steps, sharp glances cutting toward him. "I heard he says his dad's Elon Musk," a voice near the front murmured, followed by a stifled laugh. "Crazy," another kid replied. "Look at him, probably daydreaming." Ethan gripped his backpack straps, hurrying to the back, trying to shrink himself amid the crowd. He caught a new nickname, Hollywood Liar, slipping through the rows, and this time he couldn't pretend not to hear. He sat down, pressing his face against the cold window, watching rain streak the glass, wondering if he had the strength to stand in front of the class today. When Ethan entered room 305, Mrs. Harper was already at the whiteboard, holding the presentation order list. She gave him a glance, cold as usual, then turned away like he wasn't worth noticing. Ethan took his seat near the window, resting his hands on the desk to keep them from shaking. The class buzzed as students began their presentations. A brown-haired girl spoke proudly about her mom, a baker in town, her voice ringing out amid scattered applause. Ryan went next, chest puffed out, talking about his dad, a highway engineer, with a swagger like the world had to listen. Mrs. Harper laughed loudly at Ryan's joke, clapping enthusiastically when he finished, her eyes lighting up as if she'd spotted a gem. Ethan swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. Then it was his turn. "Ethan Jones," Mrs. Harper called, her voice flat, emotionless. Ethan stood, his legs wobbly like they might give out, but he forced himself to the front. He set the photo and his notepaper on her desk, took a deep breath, and began. "My name is Ethan Jones," he said, his voice small but clear, "and my hero is my dad, Elon Musk." He paused for a second, hoping for a moment of silence to continue, but there was none. Laughter erupted instantly. Loud, sharp, unstoppable. Ryan slammed his hand on the desk, clutching his stomach as he roared, "Elon Musk! You serious? Look at yourself!" Others joined in, pointing, whispering loudly. "Probably watched too many movies," a voice called from the corner. Ethan stood there, face burning, hands clutching his paper until it crumpled, but he tried to press on. "He's my dad," he said louder, voice cracking. "He taught me to stand tall, to be proud of who I am." Mrs. Harper raised a hand, signaling the class to quiet down. The laughter subsided, but smirks lingered on every face. She looked at Ethan, her eyes narrowing, lips pursed into a thin line. Then she sighed, a heavy, weary sigh laced with disdain. "Ethan," she said, her voice icy, "Career Hero Day isn't a place for make-believe stories. This is about real people in your life, not tabloid figures or movie characters you fantasize about." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his voice trembling as he replied, "But he really is my dad. I have a photo." Mrs. Harper cut him off, her tone sharp as a knife. "Enough. I don't have time for this nonsense." Her words weren't just a command. They were a severance, slicing through his truth, slashing the courage he'd mustered to stand there. The room fell silent, but not the respectful kind. It was an awkward, heavy silence, like they'd all just witnessed a crash no one wanted to acknowledge. Ethan reached for the photo, his shaking hands fumbling until it fell. The picture hit the floor, and for a fleeting moment, he saw his dad's smile lying there, trampled under the gaze of those who didn't believe him. He picked it up, walked back to his seat, head down, avoiding every eye. The floor creaked under his steps as he sat, and not one person, not a single student, not a single glance, met his. But the pain didn't stop there. As class ended, Ryan passed by, deliberately bumping Ethan's shoulder, muttering just loud enough, "Next time pick someone who looks like you, liar." Then he laughed, striding out into the hall, leaving Ethan alone amid the stream of kids. Ethan didn't go to the cafeteria that lunch. He hid in the boys' bathroom, locking himself in a stall, sitting on the toilet with the photo in his hands. He stared into Elon Musk's eyes in the picture, eyes that had once looked at him with warmth, that had told him he was stronger than anyone, but now they felt distant, like they belonged to a world he couldn't reach. Tears rolled down his cheeks, not from anger, but from the helplessness of his truth being crushed, turned into a joke by the very person meant to protect him, Mrs. Harper. He wondered if he'd been wrong to speak, if his truth was worth trading for the last shred of dignity he had left. When the final bell rang, Ethan walked home in the rain, sneakers soaked, mind blank. His mom was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, the steady thump of the knife on the cutting board filling the air. She turned when she heard the door, and instantly her eyes locked on his face. Not the usual smile, but red-rimmed eyes and slumped shoulders. Ethan said nothing, just silently handed her the crumpled presentation and the photo, then went straight to his room, shutting the door hard. Lena stood there, gripping the knife, reading every line he'd written, every word he'd poured his heart into. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she set the knife down, opened the old shoebox under the cabinet, and pulled out a scrap of paper with a phone number she'd kept for years but never called. She dialed, waited 2 rings, then a familiar deep voice answered. "Hello?" "Elon, it's Lena," she said, calm but firm. A pause. "How's Ethan?" he asked. "Not okay," she replied. "They called him a liar. The teacher, the kids, all of them, just because he told the truth." Another, Longer pause. Then he said, "I'll be there tomorrow. Tell him he didn't do anything wrong." Ethan didn't know that. As he lay in bed clutching his pillow to block out the noise, the door to his truth was about to swing open, not through his words, but through the presence of a man the world knew, yet he simply called Dad. The conflict had reached its peak, and tomorrow everything would change forever. Saturday morning, Ethan woke with an emptiness, as if all his strength had drained away the day before. He didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to face his mom, and certainly didn't want to think about returning to school on Monday. The rain still pattered outside, blending with the clatter of his mom in the kitchen, but he didn't hear her usual morning questions. Instead, an odd silence blanketed the house. Not the silence of sorrow, but of anticipation. Ethan pulled on an old hoodie, hood up to hide his face, and stepped out of his room, his feet heavy as lead. When he entered the kitchen, his mom, Lena, was standing by the table holding a coffee mug, staring out the window with a tense, distant look. "Mom," Ethan called softly, but she just turned, gave a faint smile, and said, "Sit down, honey. Today's going to be different." On the drive to school, Ethan didn't ask questions. Lena drove, hands tight on the wheel, lips pressed like she was holding something back. He sat beside her, clutching his backpack with the photo still inside, wondering if she was taking him to see the principal or do something to fix what had happened. But when the car stopped at Rockford Middle School's gate, Ethan realized this wasn't a normal school day. The yard was quiet, only a few cars scattered around, and a tall figure stood under the awning near the main entrance. The man wore a simple black coat, hood half up, but something about his stance made Ethan's heart beat faster. Lena turned to him, resting a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady. "You didn't lie, Ethan. Today they'll see that." As Ethan stepped into the hallway, the familiar cold air enveloped him, but this time it carried a strange charge, like everything was about to erupt. Lena led him to room 305, where Mrs. Harper and a few other teachers had been summoned for an emergency meeting he hadn't been told about. The door opened, and Ethan saw Mrs. Harper standing by the teacher's desk, holding a stack of papers, her face tense, lacking its usual confidence. Ryan and a few other kids, the ones who'd laughed hardest yesterday, were there too, scattered around the room, their eyes flickering between curiosity and unease. No one spoke as Ethan walked in, but the whispers started when Lena followed, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. Mrs. Harper opened her mouth, about to say something, maybe an explanation or a defense, but before a word could escape, the door swung open again. A sharp creak cut through, and the room fell deathly silent. A man stepped in, tall, his presence calm yet commanding, the hood pulled back to reveal a face the world knew. Elon Musk. Gasps rippled through the room, a few kids' jaws dropped, and Ryan nearly dropped his pencil. Ethan stood frozen, eyes wide, hands trembling, unable to believe the father he'd only seen in fragmented memories was now standing before him, in the classroom that had turned his truth into a punchline. Elon didn't speak right away. He walked to the center of the room, his keen eyes scanning every face, from the stunned kids to Mrs. Harper, now pale, clutching her papers like a shield. He stopped beside Ethan, placing a hand on his shoulder, a gentle touch, but enough for Ethan to feel the strength and protection he'd craved for so long. Then he turned to Mrs. Harper, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the space. "I hear there's been some confusion here, a big misunderstanding. You told my son he was lying. You laughed at his truth, made it a joke in front of all these people. Why?" Mrs. Harper stammered, her voice shaky. "Mr. Musk, I didn't know. I didn't think—" But Elon raised a hand, cutting her off. "You didn't think," he repeated, his tone cold as steel. "You didn't think a black boy could be my son. You looked at his skin and decided his truth was impossible, no evidence needed, no questions asked. If Ethan were a white kid, Would you have laughed? Would you have told him to sit down and shut up? Mrs. Harper opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face flushed, eyes blinking rapidly. For the first time, she had no defense. Elon turned to the students, his gaze locking on Ryan, who now stared at the floor, unable to meet it. "And you," he said, "you laughed in the face of someone telling the truth, just because it didn't match what you pictured. Families don't always look the same color. Love doesn't have to fit one shape. And truth doesn't need your permission to exist." He turned back to Ethan, his voice softening, warmer. "You didn't lie, Ethan. You stood up, you spoke about me, and I'm proud of you for that." The room was silent, not the mocking hush of yesterday, but a stunned, reflective quiet, hearts grappling with mistakes they hadn't expected to face. Ethan felt a surge of strength rising in his chest, stronger than the shame that had once weighed him down. He stepped forward, standing beside his dad, his voice small but steady. "I didn't say my dad was Elon Musk to brag. I said it because it's true, but no one believed me. Not because I didn't have proof, but because they thought I didn't belong, because I'm black." He looked straight at Mrs. Harper, meeting her eyes for the first time without flinching. "My skin doesn't define my truth or my worth, and I don't need to prove who I am to be respected." Mrs. Harper bowed her head, gripping the desk's edge, lips trembling. I was wrong," she whispered, her voice frail, almost dissolving into the air. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have believed you." But her apology faded under the sound of Elon's footsteps as he led Ethan out of the room. No more words needed. The door closed behind them, leaving a classroom full of shaken consciences and unspoken questions. Truth had walked in, not loud, not brash, but powerful enough to force that small world to look at itself. The door to room 305 shut behind Ethan and Elon, its dry thud marking a boundary between the days he'd been doubted and mocked and the moment he was finally seen. In the hallway, pale light streamed through the windows onto the cold floor, but this time Ethan didn't feel the familiar chill. His dad's hand stayed on his shoulder, solid and warm, a reminder that he no longer had to walk alone. Elon didn't say much as they stepped into the schoolyard, just turned with a small smile and asked, "You okay?" Ethan nodded, though inside he was a whirlwind of relief, pride, and a touch of disbelief that everything had just changed forever. Lena waited by the old car, her eyes lighting up as she saw them approach. She didn't cry, but her hands shook as she pulled Ethan into a tight hug, whispering, "I told you. You're never less than your truth." Elon stood aside, quietly watching, then said to her, "Thanks for keeping him strong." "I should have come sooner." Lena just nodded. No blame, no demands. She knew fame had pulled him away. But today, he'd chosen to return, not for the world, but for his son. Monday arrived like a strange new day at Rockford Middle School. News of Elon Musk's appearance spread fast, not in the loud blare of media or social posts, but in hallway whispers and stolen glances at Ethan as he walked through the gate. Mrs. Harper had called a school-wide assembly in the auditorium, and as Ethan entered with his mom, he felt hundreds of eyes turned toward him. No more laughter, no more mocking jabs, just silence, curiosity, and something like wary respect. Mrs. Harper stepped to the podium, hands clasped tightly, her face stripped of its usual sharp confidence. Her voice trembled as she began, "Last week during Career Hero Day, I made a terrible mistake. I doubted a student, not because his words weren't true, but because I let my bias blind me to the truth. I hurt Ethan Jones, and I'm sorry." She paused, looking directly at Ethan in the front row, her eyes no longer cold but heavy with regret. "Ethan, I hope you can forgive me. And I hope all of you, students, teachers, will learn what I did. We don't get to judge someone's truth by how they look, Applause started scattered, then grew, not a showy roar, but a sincere ripple of acknowledgement. Ethan felt his face heat up, not from shame, but from the strange sensation of being seen, not as Elon Musk's son, but as himself, a boy who'd told the truth and stood through the storm. Ryan, who'd laughed the loudest, wasn't in the crowd that day. Ethan later heard he'd slipped an apology note into his locker, but Ethan didn't need it. He didn't need validation from those who'd turned away. In the days that followed, the air at school slowly shifted. It wasn't perfect. There were still curious stares, hushed whispers, but Ethan was no longer invisible. Some kids who'd avoided him now struck up conversations, asking about SpaceX or Tesla with genuine curiosity. Mrs. Harper changed the most. She asked Ethan to help design a class project on truth and identity, encouraging students to share their own family stories, no matter how complex or different. Ethan agreed, not to stand out, but because he understood change only comes when someone steps up first. Elon didn't stay long. He left Sunday afternoon after a quiet dinner with Ethan and Lena at home. Before getting in his car, he hugged Ethan tightly and said, "You don't need me to prove who you are." "You've already done that." Ethan nodded. This time, he truly believed it. That night, lying in bed, he stared at the cracked ceiling, thinking of it all. The mocking laughter, the pain of doubt, the moment the door opened and his dad walked in. He whispered into the dark, "I'm not just his son. I'm Ethan Jones. And that's enough." For the first time, he felt real peace, not from others' recognition, but from his own heart. Ethan's story didn't end in grand headlines or the glare of fame. It ended in the quiet of a small house, in the dignity he'd reclaimed, and in the subtle but real shifts at a school that had once rejected him. The deepest lesson wasn't in Elon Musk's arrival, but in what Ethan proved. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it and stand until the world catches up. Prejudice can dim the light for a moment, but belief in yourself will always be the flame that never dies. And sometimes, a single spark like Ethan is enough to ignite a long road ahead.